The crystal glass was still humming on the table when the sound stopped. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a gunshot. It was something far quieter and far more devastating. The thin clink of a piece of metal hitting the polished marble floor of one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. For a second, nobody moved. The waiters stood frozen with trays in their hands. The gala guests, dressed in silk and black tie, stared down as if something sacred had just fallen there, between polished shoes and long evening gowns. And at the center of that suffocating silence stood the heir, the man who, by that point, had already humiliated that old man twice in front of strangers, now frozen in place, staring at a small bronze medal with faded ribbons that gleamed under the crystal chandelier as if it weighed more than every piece of jewelry in that room. A security guard took a step forward and stopped halfway, unsure whether to bend down, whether to speak, or simply disappear. Because everyone in that room suddenly realized they may have just witnessed, without knowing it, the beginning of something that would change forever the way that city looked at the men who sleep on its streets. What did this man do to deserve this? That question alone was worth more than every bottle of wine served that night. But to understand the real weight of that small metal disc on the floor, we need to go back 3 weeks, to a cold, gray morning with no glamour at all, on a forgotten street corner, where a man was carefully folding a worn-out coat, as if it were the last precious thing he had left in the world. It was still dark when he got up, not because he was in a hurry to get anywhere, but because the cold of dawn never let his body rest in the same spot for long. People called him different things. Some knew him only as the man on the park bench. Others simply ignored him, pretending he was part of the scenery, like a lamppost or a trash can. But to anyone who paid attention, there was something different about that man. He folded his coat. He always folded it. He smoothed out the seams with his weathered hands before tucking it into a worn backpack, as if there were still a ritual, a discipline, a remnant of order in a world that, for him, had lost all structure. He walked with his back straight, even when exhausted. He nodded politely to the few people who crossed his path at that hour. And whenever he saw another man in even worse shape than himself, he stopped. He always stopped. He shared the little he had, a piece of bread, an extra blanket, a few words of encouragement. Nobody knew exactly what he had done before ending up there. Nobody asked. People tend to look at someone living on the street and see only the present, as if that man had been born right there, on that bench, with no past and no story at all. But every human being carries chapters inside them that others never get to read, and he carried a chapter that, if told, would make a lot of people lower their heads in respect. For now, though, he was just another tired face in the city's indifferent crowd, a man trying, every single day, to hold on to a sliver of dignity in the middle of abandonment. On the other side of the city, in a penthouse apartment overlooking the harbor, another man was getting ready for the day in a completely different way. He didn't fold coats. He chose between a dozen equally expensive options, deciding which one would look best for that afternoon's board meeting. He was the heir to a fortune he had never had to build, only manage. And yet he talked about money as if every single cent were the fruit of his own merit. He treated his family company's employees with a coldness that bordered on contempt, as if he were doing them a favor just by letting them work for him at all. To this man, value and appearance were the same thing. An expensive watch said more about a person's character than any act of kindness ever could. A well-tailored suit was worth more than any life story. And it was exactly that thought, that warped ruler he used to measure people, that led him, that very same cold morning, to one of his family's restaurants, intending to have lunch with a few important business partners, with no idea that this day would mark the beginning of a downfall he was about to dig with his own hands. The restaurant was the kind of place where the silence of cutlery weighed more than any conversation. Spotless white tablecloths, waiters trained to smile even when disrespected, and a clientele that seemed to have been born right there, so naturally did they occupy that luxurious space. It was in this setting that the veteran, cold and tired, decided to step inside just to ask for some water, and maybe a few minutes of shelter from the freezing wind. He wasn't begging. He never begged. He simply sat down quietly near the entrance, trying to catch his breath, his hands trembling slightly, more from the cold than from fear. It was at that exact moment that the heir, crossing the dining room on his way to his reserved table, spotted him. And he didn't hesitate for even a second before deciding that this man was a problem to be solved in front of everyone. His voice cut through the room like breaking glass. He called over the manager, called over security, and made sure to raise his voice loud enough for the entire room to stop eating and watch. He said with open contempt that people like him didn't belong in a place like this, that his mere presence was already an insult to the customers who paid to be there. It wasn't just a request to leave. It was a carefully staged spectacle of humiliation, as if the heir needed that audience to feel powerful. The veteran didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, didn't beg. He simply stood up, in silence, picked up his backpack with still trembling hands, and walked to the door under the stares of the entire room. A few customers chuckled quietly, as if it were part of the afternoon's entertainment. Nobody stood up to defend him. Nobody said a word. And it was in that moment, surrounded by well-dressed and completely indifferent people, that the true loneliness of that man was laid bare. It wasn't just the loneliness of having no roof over his head, but the loneliness of being invisible even when every eye in the room was, at that very moment, turned directly toward him. That scene, of course, never made it out of the restaurant. But the heir's contempt, once switched on, had no intention of stopping there. In the days that followed, bothered by the simple possibility of running into that man again near his businesses, he used his connections at City Hall to push for a cleanup of the area, a cruel euphemism for removing homeless people from the blocks near his establishments. Phone calls were made. Promises of donations in exchange for public order were whispered in quiet offices, and the modest shelter where the veteran sometimes spent the coldest nights began facing pressure to cut beds, under the vague justification of administrative reorganization. The man who spent every day trying to hold on to a shred of dignity now watched even the little he had left come under threat from someone who never knew, and probably never cared to know, who he really was. And who he really was carried a weight nobody in that city knew about. Years earlier, before the streets, before the constant cold, he had a small house, but one full of family noise. He had served his country with a quiet kind of loyalty, the kind that doesn't seek medals or recognition, the kind that simply does what needs to be done when nobody else is watching. But military life demands a price that often only shows up later, in sleepless nights, in memories that don't keep a schedule, in losses that pile up until one day the person realizes they're completely alone in the world. He lost the one he loved. He lost his home shortly after. And with no support system, with nobody to reach out a hand and say, "I've got you," he slowly slipped onto the streets. Like so many other veterans whose stories the world prefers not to ask about. He never shared these details with strangers. He carried it inside his chest like an old wound, one that hurts even more when someone presses on it without knowing it's there. But, even amid so much loss, there were still threads of humanity weaving through his life. A young waitress, who worked at a simple diner a few blocks from the luxury restaurant, had noticed the veteran months earlier. At first, just a polite nod when he walked by. Then, a hot coffee on the coldest days, quietly offered, no charge, no questions, none of that pitying look that hurts so much when you've already lost everything. Little by little, a shy trust grew between the two of them. She knew his name. She knew he had served his country. She knew perhaps more about his story than anyone else alive in that city. And it was exactly that small act of kindness, that almost invisible seed planted amid the general indifference, that would later prove essential to everything that was about to happen. Because the world, however cruel it may seem at times, always leaves a crack for kindness to find its way back through. Meanwhile, the heir seemed determined to prove, again and again, that his cruelty was not an isolated accident, but a pattern of behavior. Days after the restaurant incident, spotting the veteran again on a public street near a press event launching one of the family's new developments, he didn't miss the chance to repeat the spectacle. In front of local news cameras covering the launch, he raised his voice once more, this time calling him a bum, a disgrace to the city, joking that someone should really do something about these people. Nervous laughter from a few assistants, uncomfortable looks from some of the reporters. And again, silence from those who could have said something and simply chose not to get involved. It was the lowest point so far, the moment when the public humiliation reached an even higher level than at the restaurant, closing that chapter of the story with the bitter feeling that the injustice seemed to have no limit and no brakes at all. It was this very same Heir, perhaps sensing that his public image needed urgent repair after comments began circulating behind the scenes about his arrogance, who decided to organize a grand charity gala, not out of kindness, of course, but out of strategy, bringing together business people, local officials, a retired general as guest of honor, hand-picked journalists, all of it in the very same restaurant where, weeks earlier, he had thrown out a man simply for the way he looked. The irony of that location was too great to go unnoticed, but at that moment, nobody yet knew just how ironic and how decisive that choice would turn out to be. The waitress, who knew the veteran well, ended up, through a chain of coincidences that almost felt like fate, being assigned to help out at the event that night, since the restaurant had brought in extra staff from partner diners in the area. And it was she who, seeing the man from the park bench nearby, collecting cans by the back alley of the restaurant while the party went on across the street, decided to do something nobody else would have done. She invited him in through the back, just to warm up and have something hot to drink, away from the eyes of the main dining room. She had no idea, of course, of the consequences that simple act of kindness would set in motion. She just saw a cold man and wanted to help, the same simple way she always helped. It was during this quiet movement through the service corridors that, by accident, or maybe by fate, the veteran's backpack came loose after lightly bumping into a tray cart. Simple belongings spilled onto the floor, a folded blanket, some old papers, and among them, a small object that rolled silently through a half-open door leading into the main dining room, right at the moment when the guests were gathering for the night's speeches. It was there, under the bright light of the main chandelier, in front of hundreds of people dressed to the nines, that the metal stopped rolling and lay exposed on the marble floor, gleaming quietly, waiting for someone, finally, to understand what it really meant. The retired general, the guest of honor that night, was one of the first to notice the object on the floor. His eyes, trained by decades of service to recognize symbols most people would never learn to identify, fixed immediately on the piece. He approached, bent down with the care of someone handling something sacred, and lifted the metal between trembling fingers. The room, which moments earlier had been buzzing with shallow conversations about investments and market trends, gradually fell silent, sensing that something in this decorated man's posture had completely changed. With a voice heavy with emotion but firm, he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear, exactly what that small piece of metal represented. Not some random trinket, not a meaningless keepsake, but one of the rarest honors given to soldiers who, in extreme situations, risked their own lives to save others in combat. In a few sentences that seemed to stretch for an eternity, he explained the kind of act that earned such an honor, and the entire room began to understand, with a mix of shock and shame, that the man thrown out of that very same restaurant weeks earlier, the man called a bum on a public sidewalk, was, in fact, the bearer of one of the highest proofs of courage a human being can offer another. Whispers began to spread like wildfire. Phones quietly rose into the air, recording the moment, photographing the metal, capturing the expressions of shock spreading across faces that, moments before, had been so indifferent. And it was exactly at that moment, with the room caught in that electric atmosphere of revelation, that the veteran, still behind the service curtains, realized what had happened and slowly approached. No rush, no drama, simply acknowledging that his small secret, kept for so many years, had finally found its way into the light. The Heir, who was standing in the middle of the room, about to begin his opening speech, watched the scene unfold, like a man watching his own stage being taken over by a truth he never imagined having to face there, in front of all the investors, journalists, and officials he had worked so hard to impress. The silence that settled in was not just awkward, it was almost physical, heavy, the kind that seems to push the air right out of the lungs of whoever stands at the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. The Heir tried, in vain, to regain control of the situation, mumbling something about coincidence, about not knowing who that man was, as if that somehow justified the contempt he had shown him in public more than once. But the general, with the moral authority that decades of sacrifice grant a man, didn't let the narrative be softened so easily. He asked out loud, in front of the entire room, whether human worth should really be measured by the clothes someone wears, or the bank account they hold, rather than by what that person has already proven willing to sacrifice for others. Every word landed like another weight on the heir's shoulders, and no matter how hard he tried to hold on to his usual arrogant posture, he could feel the ground crumbling beneath him with every passing second. That's when the night's true emotional twist revealed itself. Upon hearing the veteran's full name, mentioned by the general while explaining the honor, one of the gala's older guests, a senior advisor to the heir's own family company, began visibly trembling. He stepped closer, his eyes already filling with tears, and asked the veteran directly if he had served in a certain unit, in a certain region, all those years ago. The answer, confirmed with a simple nod, made that older man cover his face with his hands, overwhelmed with emotion, because it was that very veteran, decades earlier, in a nearly impossible combat situation, who had carried a wounded young soldier on his own back, under heavy fire, refusing to leave him behind even at extreme risk to his own life. And that young soldier, rescued that distant night, had grown up, come home, started a family, and was, according to the advisor's own broken words, none other than the heir's own grandfather, the very man who, moments earlier, had thrown his rescuer out without ever imagining the invisible thread that had connected them all along. The revelation hit the room like a silent thunderclap. The heir, pale as the tablecloth beside him, felt the full weight of what he had done. This wasn't just some random man he had humiliated out of pure class prejudice. This was the man whose distant act of courage may have been the very reason his own family existed the way he knew it. The contradiction between the empty talk about values and legacy he so often repeated in interviews and board meetings, and the cold cruelty he had shown that veteran, was finally laid bare, not by some outside accusation, but by history itself unfolding in front of hundreds of witnesses. He tried to speak, tried to apologize, but the words came out tangled, stripped of his usual arrogant confidence, because no matter how much wealth he had inherited, in that moment he realized, perhaps for the first time in his life, just how little he had inherited in terms of character. The consequences came fast. The journalists present weren't about to let that story slip away. Within days, the news was spreading widely, exposing not just the Gala incident, but also revisiting earlier reports of the public humiliations at the restaurant and on the street, now seen in a completely different light. Members of the company's board, worried about the brand's image, began publicly distancing themselves from the heir's behavior, some openly suggesting he be replaced in any public-facing role. The man who once measured human worth by appearance now discovered, in the harshest way possible, just how fast a reputation built on cruelty collapses once it's exposed to the light. But more important than any social or professional punishment, there was a confrontation that needed to happen between the two men, face to face. No audience, no cameras, just the truth weighing between them. That confrontation happened days later, in a setting far simpler than the Gala's ballroom. A small social services office where the veteran had been brought to receive medical assistance and proper documentation. The heir, against everything anyone who knew him would have expected, showed up alone, with no assistance, no press, dressed plainly, as if he had finally understood that this meeting wasn't about public image, but about something far more personal. He apologized, and it wasn't a performance, full of rehearsed lines. It was a hesitant, broken apology, from a man realizing, perhaps too late, the size of the damage he had caused to someone who, with no obligation at all, had saved the life of his own blood decades before. The veteran, true to his quiet, dignified nature, sought no revenge, no humiliation in return. He simply listened, looked the young heir in the eyes, and said, with the calm of a man who has already lost enough in life to understand what really matters, that true respect is never born from blood or fortune, but from the choices each person makes when nobody is watching. In the weeks that followed, the entire city seemed touched by that story. A spontaneous wave of support emerged. led at first by the very waitress who had unknowingly planted the seed for that outcome with her simple act of kindness months earlier. Donations came in, offering the veteran not just a place to live, but also access to proper mental health care, something he had neglected for years out of pride or lack of resources. The retired general, moved by the story, insisted on organizing a formal recognition ceremony, this time not at a glamorous party, but at a simple and sincere gathering, where that man's real name, his story of service and sacrifice, was finally spoken out loud, with no shame, no whispering, but with the pride that should have accompanied that name from the very beginning. The heir, for his part, though he lost some of his standing within the company's board, found, perhaps for the first time in his life, something money had never given him, a real lesson in humility. He began quietly contributing, without media attention, to initiatives supporting homeless veterans, not as a way to publicly repair his image, but as a silent attempt to honor a debt his own family, without even knowing it, had carried for generations. There was no applause for him, and perhaps there shouldn't be, but there was at least the beginning of a genuine transformation, far from the spotlight and the rehearsed speeches of before. In the final scene of this story, far from the buzz of the restaurant and the emotional intensity of the gala, we find the veteran sitting on a small porch, now part of a simple place that's finally his own. A cup of hot coffee in his hands, watching the calm movement of the street below. There was no more biting cold of dawns on the park bench, no more weight of the social invisibility that had followed him for so many years. There was only peace, peace earned not by luck, but by the simple fact that at some point, the truth found a way to be seen, even if that path had to pass through humiliation, pain, and silence before finally coming into the light. And that's exactly the lesson this story leaves behind, with no need for extra explanation or complication. Quiet heroism, built over a lifetime of sacrifice and dignity, is worth infinitely more than any fortune inherited without effort or character. Life's most important medals don't always shine on uniforms or sit behind glass in display cases. Often, they're hidden inside people the world prefers to ignore, until, by some twist of fate, the truth finally falls to the floor, right in front of everyone, and forces society to face what it should have seen all along. And you, listening to this story right now, have you ever stopped to ask yourself how many times you've judged someone by their appearance, never imagining that behind that tired face or that simple outfit, there might be a story of courage powerful enough to silence an entire room?